Now I want to move to our other speakers. Next is Dr. Peter Shearman. Dr. Peter Shearman used to be a professor at Melbourne University. He moved to Thailand with family in 2008. He used to be the director of our American Studies program at ISIS. He's now a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand. He has written books, articles, but he has not discovered the word marketing. He doesn't know about marketing. He writes these things and he stays home. So you will see a flyer with two books. One is called Rethinking Soviet Communism that he's written and published just in recent months. Another on Power Transition and International Order in Asia. This comes from a conference that I also attended with Mick Cox and Peter Shearman leading it. So Peter Shearman is the editor of this volume, Power Transition and International Order in Asia. He's an expert on Russia, Soviet Union, Cold War. Now, the students who were not born in time for the Cold War, I'm really sorry for you, because if you don't know the Cold War well, you will not really understand international relations going forward. So you have to read a lot and get a feel for the Cold War. The Cold War set a lot of the parameters and somewhat of the path dependencies of a lot of the contours and dynamics of international relations in the 21st century, early 21st century. So Dr. Peter Shearman will share a few thoughts on what the Cold War, Soviet communism, Russian tensions, and the geopolitics of Southeast Asia means.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I'm not very good at self-promotion, I must admit, in my modesty. But having said that, if anybody's interested in having a look at my books, I have copies here. Okay, well, in a way, the first two speakers have taken away some of my thunder, and I tended to agree with much of what they said. And the intervention from Professor Natthanan, which sparked some responses from our Russian guests, also I tended to agree with much of what they said in response. In fact, much of what I was going to say, or which I will say, reflects the reaction of Dr. Sumsky to the question on Ukraine. Because I think that he's right in saying that the pivot to Asia, Russia's pivot to Asia, was not in response to the United States' pivot to Asia, but rather was a response to being pushed by the United States out of Europe. And I think in a sense what we're witnessing here is the final kind of last breath of an attempt of the Russians to integrate into the West over the course of the last 25 years. It's been a course of a quarter of a century now, since the end of the Cold War, where successive leaders, from Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union through Yeltsin and Putin himself, have sought to integrate more closely and tightly into a wider West, with all kinds of different proposals to widen the security parameters outside of the context of NATO through the wider Eurasian, wider Europe, if you like, rather than a deeper European Union. And of course, my view is, and it's shared by others increasingly so, is that the European Union itself has become securitized. And I'm not just referring to the response now to illegal immigration from Libya into European shores by imposing naval forces, or this is their proposal, but I'm also talking about the expansion of the European Union to former Soviet states with the pressure there also to join NATO. There are very few members of the EU now that are not also members of NATO. Now, in relation to Ukraine, I can't let that go without making a comment before I start the essence of my talk. there are deep causes of any conflict, there are intermediate causes of any conflict, and then there are precipitate causes of conflicts. Now, the precipitate cause of the conflict in Ukraine and Crimea, of course, was the overthrow of an elected government in Kiev, in what the Russians understandably call an illegal coup. And of course, this coup was supported by the United States, in the sense that we have Victoria Nuland handing out biscuits, John McCain, the Euromaidan Square with the demonstrators, manifestly, demonstratively showing their support. Ukraine was split, and I remember Kerry saying that the Ukrainians are split, they're divided. Yes, they were divided, but America made it quite clear whose side they were on. They actually took sides. And this was the red line, this was the last straw. So this is when Russia was pushed further to the east, to look east. Now, the deep and intermediate causes of the conflict in Ukraine, of course, go back a long time. They go back to the historical circumstances of the expansion of the Russian Empire. And the Ukrainians, you go back to Kiev and Rus. You go back centuries of interlinked relations culturally, historically, politically, between the Russians and Ukrainians. Condoleezza Rice in her memoirs referred to Ukraine as so important to to Russia that if it was to split off, it would not just be like the United States losing Texas, but it would be like the United States losing the original 12 federal colonies. That was before the events in Ukraine took place, of course. He wrote her memoirs before 2013. A former ambassador to the Soviet Union, in fact, the last ambassador in the last stages of the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, also said that it was inconceivable that Russia would allow Ukraine to join NATO in Sevastopol to become a naval base for NATO. It's just inconceivable. It could never happen. And it's always interesting to counterfactualize in those sort of circumstances and imagine what the United States would have felt if after the end of the Cold War it had lost and the Soviet Union had won and then started expanding the Warsaw Pact closer to American borders, incorporating Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. And again, if you counterfactualize and imagine that kind of world, you can understand the extent to which the Russians themselves perceive the situation in Ukraine. Anyway, what I was going to do was to point out, when analyzing any important shift in international politics, there are three different basic levels of analysis which enable us to understand and explain those shifts. You have the international level, what we call the systemic level of analysis, which relates to the balance of power and questions of polarity. And then you can look at the domestic level of the politics, the history, the culture, the politics of identity, and the nature of the regime at the domestic level. And then you have the individual level, the level of the individual person. How significant are individuals? Now, if you look at the Western narrative of what's been happening over the course of the last few years, in particular in relation, say, to Georgia 2008 and Ukraine 2013 onwards, the narrative is one which focuses upon that third level of analysis. President Vladimir Putin is seen as the person who's responsible in large part for these events. And maybe also there's this psychological hangover from the Cold War where some Americans in particular find it difficult to perceive of anything else than Russia is a sort of threat. And Russia's empires, of course, in the past declined and evaporated on 3 different occasions. So there's people who argue that Putin is seeking to restore the Soviet empire. I think that's wrong. I think they're looking at the wrong level of analysis. As important as Putin might be as an individual, I think it's the other 2 levels we need to look at. We need to look at the changing balance of power in the international system and the questions of polarity. And we also need to look at the domestic level, more widely speaking. My view is that if it wasn't Putin in the Kremlin, over the course of the last few years, the world will be a much worse place. Now, I'm not someone who's writing a love letter to Putin. I'm not a huge, necessarily a fan in many aspects of what Putin's policies at the domestic level. But we have to remember that alternatives would not be a Western liberal-oriented individual. If you look at the elections over the course of the post-Soviet period, the individuals that are supported by the West have fared really poorly in elections. And it's not just because the elections are fixed. Putin's popularity ratings in Russia is not because of the propaganda from the Russian media, although of course that would help. It's genuine. So that's the first point I'd make, is that you need to look at the proper level of analysis. And if you do that, if you go back to the end of the Cold War, and I think Dr. Natthanan is absolutely right in saying that we need to understand the contours of this particular historical period to understand where we are now. Because when the Cold War ended, I haven't got time to go back and look at the details of the Cold War, what ended, of course, was bipolarity. What ended was a world dominated by two superpowers, and all the other states in the international system identified themselves as part of or neutral against either of these two giant superpowers. So when bipolarity gave way to unipolarity, at the domestic level of analysis, Russia looked to the West. Gorbachev, as the last Soviet president, was not articulating a view that Russia belonged to a common Asian home. He articulated the view that Russia belonged to a common European home. When the Soviet Union was dismantled, and I think that's the correct word to use, dismantled, it happened overnight. Now, it's common to say that Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, neither was the Russian Empire built in a day. Neither was the Soviet Empire built in a day. It goes back over centuries. But what's remarkable about the end of the empire is that it did end in a day. It ended overnight. It ended overnight, to most people's amazement and surprise. So one morning, Russians woke up, and so did all other former Soviet citizens, to find that their country had gone. And we haven't got time to go into the details of how that happened, but nevertheless, it led to what, in a sense, was an identity crisis for the Russians. Who are we? Well, they were part of a wider Europe. Yeltsin and his foreign minister Kozyrev engaged with the West, and of course the United States in particular sought to help in aid to facilitate Russia's integration into the global economy and also into a wider West. The end of history thesis, you've all heard it from Fukuyama, was that this was a final victory for liberal democracy. And yet what actually happened, of course, was the Washington Consensus, shock therapy, the expansion of NATO, and Russia itself, by the 1990s, ended up as a basket case. It was almost a failed state. Russia almost became a failed state in the 1990s. A failed state with nuclear weapons, which was the largest country in the world. Now, what partly saved us from that scenario actually taking place was the rise of a new leadership after Yeltsin. And this was, of course, the rise of Putin. But Putin, nevertheless, continued with a fundamentally Western-oriented foreign policy. There were even hints at different stages under Yeltsin and Putin for Russia to join NATO. But of course, if that was to take place, then it was probably inconceivable, but nevertheless it was broached as a potentiality. It would have meant that Russia would have had to have an equal status with the other players, and that was almost something which was inconceivable from the American standpoint. So not only was Russia increasingly isolated from the West, but the West continued to expand a military organization with no logical purpose. NATO was established initially, you'll remember, to contain the Soviet Union. So you had the Warsaw Pact forces on one side and NATO on the other side. When the Soviet Union imploded and the Warsaw Pact was disintegrated and disbanded, NATO didn't die a natural death, as alliances should do, but it started to expand. The logic for expansion was to facilitate democratic promotion. Democracies don't go to war against each other was a basic premise of this logic when Bill Clinton was persuaded by Stroke Talbot and others to expand the alliance to four more former Soviet allies and then former Soviet states, former republics of what was comprised the USSR. So not only was NATO, Russia was trying to join the West, but the West was excluding Russia. And then the next thing we have is NATO being used ostensibly for collective security and humanitarian intervention in the former Yugoslavia. And again, against the wishes of not just the Soviet Union, not just Russia, sorry, but also of China. But this was because of that one level of analysis. If you look at the systemic level, America could do this because it was the hegemonic state in the international system with no counterbalancing forces preventing it from happening. 3 minutes, okay. I've not even got to Asia yet, so I've only got a few minutes left. So I guess what I'm saying is that Russia didn't jump. Russia was pushed into Asia. And it was pushed into Asia by misperceptions, misunderstandings, or perhaps even, as some would see it, American aggressive policies, which ultimately led Russia with no real other choice than to look towards the East and in particular to China. Now, I was going to conclude with a few minutes, which I haven't got now, to say why I think this will not last very long. And it's not just because of what Dr. Natthanan said about the history of conflict between Russia and China, almost going to war with each other in 1969, despite sharing similar ideologies, both communist systems. But because I think the United States will recognize the dangers, already have recognized the dangers indeed, of a Russian strategic alliance with China. And the manifestation of that, I think, is evident by the visit of Victoria Nuland and the American Secretary of State to Russia last week. I think this is an indication, to talk about Ukraine, that Ukraine is a problem which needs to be resolved through diplomatic means by bringing in Russia, and maybe the ultimate resolution of the conflict in Ukraine will be some kind of federalism and, for want of a better term, and this is one Kissinger used, a Finlandization of Ukraine. Ukraine between the East and West, if you like, a solution to the problem which will be acceptable to both sides. And I think once that happened, Russia's orientation will move back to the West and back to a wider conception of Europe, where it actually, I think, belongs. Okay, thank you.
It's interesting that you concluded with that the notion that this is temporary, that this eastward turn eventually will end up going west again. So we really are talking about 300 years going back to Peter the Great, another Peter, which is fascinating that, you know, Russia has been trying to go west, but it's been rejected, pushed back, now it's coming east. But will it go west again? And in your view, Dr. Peter Shearman, it will. So here are his 2 books. You can have a look. And he's writing 2 more books. Okay, and they'll be ready sometime, I don't know, a year or 2 or something. But obviously he's an expert. Let me move now to my colleague, Dr. Natthanan. We also have a European Studies program here. Dr. Natthanan Kunnamas is the director of the master's degree, master's program in European Studies. She's also the deputy director of the European Studies Center on campus. She's our, if you will, view the ASEAN professor in Moscow. She is the Europe professor, EU professor on the Chulalongkorn campus. Dr. Natthanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Thitinan. As introduced by Professor Thitinan, I am responsible for the master degree in European Studies and PhD program as well. We just opened PhD last year, just the first batch. So my talk going to be from like a European Union affairs followers with a moderate Russian studies followers. Well, when we speak of Russia's pivot and the westward or eastward turn, I think from my perspective, I could contribute a lot about why Russian moved from the west. Not entirely moved from the west to the east. And well, before talking to that, I would like to raise two important points in which my are kind of very interrelated. The first one is that I got some strong feelings that maybe differ from other scholars that Russia and the U.S. got the quite a common or the same interest in Asia Pacific in terms of the issue of nuclear security, issue of North Korea, issue of border disputes, or importantly, the rise of China, even the peaceful rise or the aggressive rise, that they are both worrying about this case a lot. This is a very common belief that we talk for a long time on the rise of China, in which I would like to maybe raise the point that, well, if I'm taking the Ukraine crisis as a timeline before Ukraine crisis started in 2014, and after the Ukraine crisis, is this issue really large enough to make Russia feeling, well, to make the President Putin careless about the rise of China and want to make friends with China more? And, well, starting with the pre-Ukraine crisis in 2014, like I previously mentioned, that my opinion is that the issue of Moscow and Washington are the same in Asia Pacific. The interest is more on nuclear security, more on economic growth, more on trade cooperation, and of course, East Asia is a very dynamic region in terms of the huge saving, the large markets for both Russia and the U.S. And Russia will be more special in terms of the country export a lot of oil and gas. The energy is very important factors, and in the same way, it could be the Achilles heels of Russia as well. So before Ukraine crisis, I think China, the role of China is quite good to Russia, because China support Russia a lot in terms of to be international alliance, like in the UNSC, that China kept supporting Russia in terms of extension, in terms of the human rights issue, that the West tried to pressure Russia domestic politics. And what happened is when the issue of Ukraine start from I think the late 2013 on the issue of association agreement, that the EU and Ukraine about to sign the agreement, and then there's a rejection of the signing of the agreement, and then there is a protest later. And then in 2014, there's the issue become very seriously escalated. So the issue of Crimea is very important because after the referendum and after the treaty of annexation of Crimea was signed, this is a really very a test case for President Putin's diplomacy, because President Putin did I think he got the plan several years that, and this is a Russian Orthodox way. The way of doing diplomacy is that we need to fight. We need to be ready for finding alternatives or the new pivots, like Professor Natthanan say. So he did say that we have to catch the Chinese wind in the sails of our economies, or we cannot isolate ourselves. And the more the EU or the more the West pressure Russia, I think with the sanctions or maybe embargoes in the near future in the issue of the Black Sea, I think the way to Asia or the Eastward turn will be more intense. So that's why I really take the Ukraine, the Crimea thing as very important timeline for the pivot turn of Russia. And if we talk about China's role again after Crimea, we see that China really sacrificed herself for Russia in terms of in UNSC again by abstain on the issue that the other members want to invalid the referendum of Crimea, and China even they got their own problems of Tibet and Taiwan, but they still become a very good allies of Russia. And if we're looking at the case of Crimea again to the other Asia Pacific, maybe the secondary power, like Japan and India, this is slightly different roles in which we see how Japan was very reluctant towards Russia because, well, Japan is like one of the Western club that need to go along and need to invalidate the Russia's stand on Ukraine and on Crimea. But Japan also got internal need for Russia's involvement because they're having the energy problem because they got the Fukushima disaster in 2011, and that energy power was in disaster, and they need the energy supply from the most important energy power, which is Russia. And they were like the largest LPG, or I'm not sure whether LPG or consumers of the world. So the roles of Japan was to engage with Russia was in dilemma in terms of economic interest and the commitment of Japan as like a international liberal democratic world. But India, you see how India was very determined in terms of making friends with Russia, because if taking Professor Natthanan talk about, we need to study a lot about the Cold War. We know that India got a sense of, still have a sense of a little bit of socialist, non-aligned movement since the end of the Second World War, and also Indonesia and Malaysia to some extent. So India was largely support Russia in the issues of Ukraine and the issues of Crimea. But more than that, India and Russia was cooperate for a long time in terms of security partnership, even during the Cold War. So we see how like if we're taking the Japanese flying geese model, and China was at the forefront of the flock of the geese, and India and Japan was the second row of the flock. We see how India was very serious and very objective. I say very objective in terms of making relations with Russia than Japan. And when we talk about ASEAN, Asia Pacific at large, we see how Russia make a big, very big move. Like Professor Koldunova just say that they have a new post, new ministry, the finance ministers, that to deal specifically with the region, and well, the other physical infrastructure is very, very important, like the special economic zone, especially the Vladivostok one. And this is going to be a very, very good opportunity for the Asia Pacific, especially the one that border with Russia, like China or Korea. And if I'm talking about Russia and ASEAN, I met Kun Bunn again. We haven't met for 4 years ago, but we already divide our tasks already, that he could talk a lot about ASEAN. He's an ASEAN strategist guy. But roughly, I could say that if you talk about Russia and ASEAN or Southeast Asia, there were two things. There were ASEAN as an organization, right? And we see how Russian approach ASEAN dialogue a lot. And there's the other track in which a bilateral relationship between the individual Southeast Asian members with Russia. And we see how are different when we talk about 10 ASEAN members. We see how Vietnam, Malaysia, maybe Indonesia was quite accommodate Russia for a long time, and this has contributed a lot about the Cold War ideology in the past. And when Prime Minister of Russia visit Thailand, we talk about the relationship between Russia and Thailand, and like His Excellency just say that Russia's the eastward turn of Russia is not just happened because Thailand and Russia was having diplomatic relationship for numbers of centuries. But however, unfortunately, during the Cold War, I think the Thai side or the Thai government need to rethink a lot about having the cordial relationship with Russia, because during the Cold War, well, honestly speaking, we as Thailand, we are not really kind, not really nice to Russia, to the Soviet Union, because if you study the history of ASEAN during the Cold War, there's some point that when the sense of the anti-communism is very strong at that time, and ASEAN need to frame that threat. Who who should be our threat between the Soviet Union and China? Well, I think Malaysia says China, right? Indonesia says China, but Thailand says the Soviet Union. And because we are the only frontline state are under the domino fear that we are going to be the next domino, so the remaining ASEAN say, okay, we need to push the hardline stance towards the Soviet Union and toward Vietnam. So that really troubled the relationship in certain phase of the Cold War between Thailand and Russia, and we need to rethink a lot because well, in the terms of now, well, we are under the, I think Thailand and Russia are in the same position because Russia was pressured by the West. And Thailand also was pressured by the West as well in terms of election call or whatever. So I think it's a golden opportunity now that the Thai government need to do something with Russia, especially in terms of trade, in terms of economy. And don't forget that even we are in the political mess for 10 years, for a decade, but Thailand is the largest trading partner of Russia in Southeast Asia. And Thailand was still running trade deficit with Russia because Russia, we import a lot of very, very valuable, very high pricey products from Russia. So we need to rethink, and I think I'm over time, right? Okay, thank you. I end here. I could contribute more during questions.
Thank you, Natthanan. Thank you very much. Let me just pick up on that point. Thailand and Russia have a lot in common. Alienation from the West, the Western alienation, if you will, with the Eurasian identity, but perhaps Russia, West, East, but eventually maybe West. The preference perhaps would be West, but by necessity is East. So in Thailand, I think this is today is 1 year anniversary of our coup, the last coup. And the pressure from the West, I think, has nudged the Thai government towards the East, if you will, China and Russia. But the tendency, the preference would be to be in the West. So this could be temporary. But if the Western pressure is sustained, is lasting, then it could be more permanent. Could be more permanent. Last speaker, Bunn, please help us make it kind of bring ASEAN into it. I mean, you're from Malaysia. Bunn Nagara is a senior editor, journalist in the Malaysia publishing industry. I mean, worked in several papers. We have an equivalent of him, a kind of a colleague, Gawi Chongkitawan, who's abroad, otherwise he'd be here today. So Bunn, help us look at the Malaysia side, and we're looking at Southeast Asia. So what does it mean for the geopolitics of Southeast Asia, Russia's eastward turn?
Thank you, Professor Natthanan. I have quite a number of points to mention. I hope there is enough time because they're all relevant, I think. But first of all, let me just perhaps clarify some of the basic issues in ASEAN, including in Malaysia. But of course, my comments are personal. We do not represent anyone. First of all, I think I would agree with Dr. Victor Sumsky in saying that when countries are identified as having certain alignments or alliances with certain great powers, this should not always be assumed to be permanent. This cannot be assumed without any recourse for change or reform within those countries themselves. One example very recently has been Britain and the AIIB, China's proposal for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Until about a month ago, for decades, the country in Europe that has been the most supportive of China's growth has been Germany. It was one of the biggest Western investors in China. It remains so. But about a month or so ago, the first European country to want to join the AIIB was Britain, the closest ally of the United States. I think this is indicative of the times. And I think this again reminds us that we should not take things for granted in terms of alliances and alignments, because ultimately every country decides based on its own interests. We don't have to be neo-realists necessarily to argue that, but I think that is the basic reality. But I would not agree with another point raised by Dr. Sumsky in that ASEAN, as he said, was in some way aligned during the Cold War, and is often assumed to be aligned to the West. We do not have the time now here, but I'd be very happy to give a whole seminar on this. The point is that ASEAN is and has always been pro-regional status quo. It is not and never has been pro any outside power. And that is the very basis of ASEAN. If it were otherwise, many countries in ASEAN today, including Indonesia and Malaysia, would not have been in ASEAN. They would not have been in ASEAN, because these have been non-aligned countries, very clearly. This is not to say that certain ASEAN member countries have not been aligned to the West. They have been. This is not to say that perceptions of ASEAN did not exist for being aligned or in alliance to the West. There have been such perceptions. This is not to say also that there have not been any pressures and so on for ASEAN to be more aligned, but there have been. So the point is, ASEAN as a whole has not been and isn't aligned to any country because it cannot afford to do so. Because ASEAN is of the region, its primary goal is national interest based on three essential points: peace, stability, and prosperity. And in ASEAN's thinking, peace, stability, and prosperity would not be possible if ASEAN were aligned to any great power. Because any alliance dictates that to be aligned to one is at the same time to be aligned against the others in a very competitive geostrategic world. Let me just go back to the point about the issue of Russia's eastward turn. I would like to, if there is going to be any titling of talk, I would like to title this as Looking Beyond the Urals, How Southeast Asia Anticipates the Future. Because this is about the future based on Russia's turn to the east, and I would call it Looking Beyond the Urals, because Russia and the Soviet Union before, and then Russia before that again, has always been about Moscow. This has been Russia's great weakness. An overrepresentation of the western part of Russia, when it is a Eurasian country, as Dr. Sumsky correctly said, 2/3 at least of the Russian territory is Asian. A minority part of it is in the West, but it's a more important part because politically and culturally it has been a Western country. And this is a problem not just Russia today, but also during the Soviet Union. I would go back even during Tsarist times. Russia has overinvested in the West, and I believe it has all along underinvested in the eastern portions, not just in Asia, but also underinvested in the Russian Far East in terms of priorities, infrastructure, building relations, and so on. And this is something that is unsustainable, especially when Russia has territories and claims to territories such as the Kuril Islands, which are disputed. This has weakened Russia. Now look at another big country today, the United States. It's a powerful country not because it has the biggest economy in the world alone, not just that, although it helps, but also because it is a continental-sized country with access to 2 oceans. Russia can have that, but it has overinvested in the West. It has underinvested in its access to the East, and of course 1 or 2 seas in between as well. So I think very clearly for both economic and strategic reasons, it makes sense for Russia to do more in the East, to invest more, but this requires a major effort and a very sustained effort, which, like many people, I'm not sure can be sustained. I think Dr. Peter Shearman is right to say that Russia was pushed rather than jumped to the East, but I would prefer to put it in a slightly different way, that there's a push and pull factor involved. The push factor, of course, is the negative response and reception to Russia from the West, but also at the same time, the East represents first economic opportunities that can be tapped better, and secondly, no less importantly, geostrategic options for Russia. This is something that should have been recognized much earlier. But Russia, unfortunately for itself, lost valuable time in investing in its East as well as in East Asia. I have 6 areas I would like to run through in relation to this. First of all, is the problems facing Russia's Asia pivot, as you may call it. Secondly, the likely regional response to Russia's turn. Thirdly, the common themes and objectives that are shared between Southeast Asia and Russia. Fourth, differences between Southeast Asia and Russia, differences which need not be problematic but need to be understood. Fifth, for a streamlined and problem-free Go East policy for Russia. This is for the interests of both Russia and Southeast Asia in particular. Sixthly, some basic questions to ask and maybe find answers to. Firstly, the problems facing Russia's eastward turn. I will just give 10 points very briefly. 1, the bureaucratic and institutional inertia in forging something new and unfamiliar, basically relations with Asia. Secondly, the negative international image of a hesitant and uncommitted novice as a player in Asian affairs. So Russia is still a new player relatively in Asia, precisely because of its underinvestment in the East. Thirdly, the weighty diversions competing for policy attention and resources, such as Ukraine, that are diversionary and distracting. Fourth, the absence of an impressive track record in Asia, Asia-type dealings to assure potential partners and investors in this region. Then there are 6 items that I would mention briefly that are perceived as Russia's eastward turn as having lack of substance, because these 6 items are actually Russia's lack in these 6 areas. 1, a lack of a cohesive, visionary and integrated plan over the long term and over the whole space of East Asia, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, beyond individual piecemeal deals and agreements that we have seen so far. Next, lack of resources from Russia for an enduring investment in a major project of this kind. Next, the lack of consistency and demonstrable commitment towards the whole turn Asia or turn eastward effort. Then, lack of institutional preparedness in Russia to support the effort and to give it substance. Then, a lack of appreciation and understanding of Asian cultural norms and institutional processes that we've seen so far. Much more work needs to be done in Russia, and particularly in Moscow. Then, a lack of experience in operating smoothly, optimally, and confidently in East Asia or even in the Russian Far East. Too much concentration again in Moscow. The second area, likely regional responses to Russia's pivot from countries in this region, basically mentions to them. 1, the primary or national responses of individual countries. Secondly, the secondary or regional institutional responses. Thirdly, consequential or follow-up responses based on the responses of major powers themselves. And fourthly, the inadvertent or negative responses that should be avoided. Now, under the primary or national responses to Russia's eastward turn, I would like to mention 3 points. 1, this is to be determined by issues or goals of Russia, whether these goals are competing or mutual, such as in trade agreements and exchanges. Secondly, the health of the bilateral diplomatic relations with countries in this region, whether these relations would support or detract from key economic interests. Thirdly, the history of bilateral relations would be a core factor. Whether they're positive or negative, they are bound to be influential. And this depends to a large extent on the individual country members' relations with Russia, and it's a bilateral two-way responsibility. The other area would be the secondary or regional institutional responses from this region. Cautious, tentative, largely observational. This will take time to see more clearly and to achieve more substantive results. Much will depend on Russia's policies, actions, and intentions in style, because many Asian countries are very reactive in nature. Next would be the prospect, a positive reaction from countries in this region, whether the response will be smooth and seamless in terms of partnerships and promoting confident reciprocities. Or another kind of prospect would be a negative reaction, which would be doubt and suspicion of countries in this region growing into mutual recrimination and hostility. So for the interest of all concerned, let's hope that does not happen. The third dimension will be consequential responses of countries in this region as a result of major power responses to Russia's eastward turn. First of these will be division and partisanship or factionalism, maybe even tending towards a new Cold War. Again, a negative. Then the next one, Russian postures, one, where Moscow stands relative to the US, China, and Japan, whether Russia's position is one that is complementary or serving as an alternative. I would suggest if it is seen as playing a complementary role to these major powers, it would be more acceptable and welcomed. If not, if it is seen as an alternative, then countries would be forced to choose, and this would not be welcomed by any country. The Russian postures too would be how Moscow responds to moves by these major powers, US, China, and Japan, whether Russia would behave in a cool, calm, and collected manner, or instead act in a tense, rash, and unpredictable manner. That would be most unwelcome in this region. The fourth dimension, there would be inadvertent or negative responses by countries in this region, which are largely perceptual. First of these being Russia being seen as too close to China, perhaps. That would increase the sense of challenge to the West and its allies in this region. Again, a negative. Another would be Russian policy or perceptions of Russian policy being unduly or disproportionately militarist rather than economic or diplomatic in nature. So if Russia is wise enough to learn from the mistake of the US, for example, where the US pivot is seen as largely military, then Russia would avoid that. If it repeats that, it will not be welcome, definitely. But if it can be seen to be a more sensitive player, then I think it has more advantages. The next would be perceived lack of sensitive or nuanced handling of relations with countries in this region, in particular Vietnam. And within Vietnam, in particular, the issue of Cam Ranh Bay facilities. I think right now that is a big question. This is a very topical issue, but there are also other more enduring issues that are broader and larger in nature, relating to various sensitivities of countries in this region that Russia must be very careful of and must know how to handle in a very intelligent manner. The other point under inadvertent or negative responses based on perceptions would be the possible transfer of baggage of Russia from troubled regions, whether they're Ukraine or Chechnya, to East Asian relations. If any such negative baggage is transferred, it would be very bad for relations between Russia and countries in East Asia. The third area I would comment on would be the common themes and objectives between Southeast Asia and Russia, something to build on and to encourage. One is pragmatism in policy matters, including with disputes and other contentious issues. The problem or difference today is no longer ideological, but whether and how they impinge on national interests. Secondly, the sense of national sovereignty, particularly over territory or airspace, and the rights of countries and their international prerogatives in multilateral groupings. Thirdly, the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign states. This is seen as an ASEAN principle, but actually it's a United Nations principle that preceded the formation of ASEAN. It is just that ASEAN specifically emphasizes it. Fourth, regional non-alignment and global multipolarity, despite individual national alignments in a broader regional non-aligned mindset. Again, individual countries have the right and continue to have the right whether or not to align themselves and how to align themselves. But regionally, it has to remain, to my mind, a non-aligned region collectively. Fifth point, common prosperity, policy reciprocity, and actions to serve mutual interests. If this can be demonstrated and seen to be in evidence, then I think Russia's role will be welcomed again. The fourth area, differences between Southeast Asia and Russia, which need not be problematic, but important to know, are firstly, the issue of big to small power relations, again, incurring certain national sensitivities very often. The experiences and perceptions of such expected inequalities and asymmetries need to be recognized. Secondly, the cultural mindsets that are different. Western Europeans still very much in Russia, and Eastern Asians still for countries in this region. Thirdly, different work cultures. Operational norms and business as well as in diplomacy, I think, have to be understood. Fourth, lingering disputes, for example, over island territories that can limit or upset future relations with countries in this region. And fifth, a lack of follow-through when Moscow is still not of Asia. Still a lot remains to be done, and there's much work remains for full-scale, long-term investments. Even in the case of the U.S., which has been active in this part of the world for so long, it has seen a lack of follow-through because the latest, in terms of the U.S. pivot, for example, has seen a very inconsistent response from the U.S. Now, for a streamlined, problem-free go-east policy in the interest of both Russia and countries in this region, I think Moscow would be well advised to be more open to more Asian countries, because so far its close relations have seemed to be mostly with China. To be more business-minded in identifying areas of agreement and cooperation with other countries. To be more competitive in offering better trade terms to potential partners. To be more innovative in proposing partnership possibilities, including jointly working on complementarities. To be more business-like in acting more consistently in business terms with partners. To exercise greater diplomatic finesse in bilateral and multilateral relations. To invest more in Go East aspirations, and to budget more for them accordingly. To develop the Far Eastern regions, to expand productive capacity as well as the necessary human expertise, to show more commitment to grand plans for working with countries in Asia, to prepare to drop old habits and mindsets and not allow them to weigh on the prospects for working in Asia, to become more aware, that is, in terms of language, norms, cultures, and expectations, and to become more adaptable in evolving from a Moscow centrism to an East Asian orientation. Finally, just 3 questions briefly to ask. How real or substantive is Russia's Go East policy? We still don't know much about it. India under Modi has seen from a look east policy to an act east policy, is trying to substantiate this. And China is offering more substance even in its One Belt, One Road proposal. But even so, China is not providing enough details, I think, for countries in this region to welcome it fully. Second question to ask is, how sustainable is Russia's Go East policy? From what we can see so far, nothing indicates it will be as enduring as the project requires. Third question, how far does the Russian state itself understand the importance of this policy? If Russia understands it fully, then I think looking east is not a problem, that it can be meaningful and productive. And the rest, I think, is for us to see. Thank you.